Good afternoon, folks. I wanted to start off by doing a little bit of review of map principles in GIS in general, and along the way introduce some of the visionary ways in which GIS is being used to approach a few sort of general areas of concern or issues of concern. And so what I'm starting off with here, I'm in the ArcGIS software, and you'll recall that there are three principal areas of practice in terms of what we do in GIS, and those can be divided into the categories of data management, analysis, and visualization. And I'm going to start with the visualization side of things, at the most basic level, this refers to the creation of maps. And maps, of course, are abstractions of reality, and we have different methods of cartographic representation that we can use. And there are, most hard copy maps will have a title and a legend and so forth, which I won't go into much detail on those today, but I did want to start off by talking about landscape representation. And what we have here is a general hillshade view of North America. And I'll draw your attention to the top of the screen here where it says map scale. And the map scale here is shown at 1 to 36 million, 36,884. All right, so what does that mean exactly? Well, that means that we are reduced at a fraction of this 1 to 1/36 millionth of the actual Earth's surface. Now, as I zoom in, and this was something that came up on the exam, as I zoom in on this, you'll notice that the scale changes. So we're now at 1 to 26 million scale. So we're at a slightly larger scale. And as we draw in, you'll notice that the number on the right side of the ratio gets smaller. We actually describe this as a larger scale because as we move in, we will actually resolve to increasing levels of detail. This is called a scale dependency. And so all of a sudden now we're seeing roads and other features at this 1 to 1 million scale. And as I draw in a little bit further, I'm now at the 1 to 615,000 scale. And I'll draw in now 1 to 334,000, okay? And if I get myself in even closer, now we've resolved ourselves to an even finer level of detail. And actually, this is using the traditional topographic map with contour lines to represent this. You can actually see that there's a hillshade that's drawn behind this. So the concept of scale and several different ways to do cartographic representation is reflected there. So we're going to be looking at a few different maps, and one of them that we'll look at for a moment here because it represents a thematic mapping. This is actually a choropleth method of mapping where maps all areas are represented by polygons that have particular values to them. And in this case, the values are represented as these different descriptive place names for ecoregions. So an example of a cartographic map, again, falling under the category of visualization, data visualization. Now, data management is very important in GIS, and so I'm just going to briefly show you some of the ways in which we can organize our data. So I have a folder called the GIS Data Library with broad folders for California. You see global, North State region, and underneath this organization, I can view specific areas. So for example, Europe, I'm actually going to be looking at some data from the Nature Conservancy. You see North America. If I go into the Nature Conservancy data, I see a few folders, and I see a geographic database. And under this geographic database, I can store tables and I can store geographic features. These are the regions that you looked at that are shown as polygons. And you can actually even establish relationships between tabular data and your geographic or spatial data. And so this is the idea of data management, that you have the ability to be able to store things in containers, to establish relationships, and to maintain the integrity of this vast store of data that we're going to be working from. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the analysis side of things. And again, I'm using data from the Nature Conservancy, which is a global conservation organization. A friend of mine actually does GIS with the Nature Conservancy. And so they're interested, obviously, in the preservation of places that have particular ecological value. And so we could come through and say, all right, well, here's some broad categories of what they're describing as ecoregions. And I'm going to sort of scroll over to an area that I want to give a little attention to. I'm just going to turn off this base map because sometimes it can slow the processing speed down just a bit. The island of Borneo here is an area that we'll talk a little bit more about. It's an area of focus for my research in the world. And one of the things you'll notice here is that we track these areas along the coast called mangroves, which are really ecologically important wetland forest areas and home to unique species, not only in Borneo, but other parts of the world. So as a simple analysis example, I'm interested in knowing which countries of the world actually host these mangroves. And so all I'm going to do is establish a simple query. And again, this isn't something that you guys are required to know how to do in this particular software. We teach this in the Geog 9 and 10 class coming up next semester. You'll get a chance to start interacting with these with this software. But in this case, I just want to search on mangroves, which is the name stored in a field that has a somewhat cryptic name to it. But if I go ahead and execute this query, it'll go ahead and select each of the areas in the world that is designated as a mangrove. You can see them highlighted in light blue. So now I'm interested in which countries actually contain those mangroves. So here's a layer that includes the countries of the world. There's the countries of East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and so forth. But rather than just searching our way around the map, why don't we select those countries? So now I'm going to do a simple analysis using the data that we just located. I'm going to select countries that grab these that intersect the selected features of our ecoregions. And so now we have a number of countries selected, and we could take a look at those selected countries. We could sort them alphabetically, and we can see this list of the 64 countries in the world that have mangroves. Okay, so a simple example of GIS analysis. So now we've seen an example of data management, data representation, and data analysis. Okay, so let's leave that. Again, this is an example of how GIS is being used for conservation purposes. Maybe before I leave this, I'll just indicate that the Nature Conservancy has properties all over the world and all over California as well. And so each of these areas are areas that the Nature Conservancy manages in some capacity or another, or has some involvement with. And so, for example, here's a place called the Manton Plains site. This is a very ecologically important area that's just to the east of Redding. And they may or may have some sort of a involvement, maybe with the local landowner. And they provide a hyperlink to this information so you can find out a little more information about it. That particular one doesn't have, the link looks to be broken. Okay, so it gives you an example of GIS for conservation purposes. Now, an important element of what we're looking at here is the use of GIS for social justice purposes. And so we're going to be interested in looking at one example, which is participatory mapping and participatory GIS, or PGIS. And just as an kind of bit of a background, this is in the lecture this week, gives an emphasis on local knowledge of resources, place names, property, boundaries, sacred sites, and so forth. And it provides communities with a new perspective on their lands and also a sense of self-determination, especially for underserved populations. This is the issue of social justice, that people have a need to be able to be engaged in their own fate, and it's an issue of justice to be able to provide this to people around the world. And so for some local communities, especially indigenous communities, this can involve retaining land rights. So in the map preparation process, we would go in and interview elders and others that are knowledgeable in the community. We conduct tactile and sketch mapping activities to spark spatial awareness. I'll show you an example in a moment. Identify priorities for mapping, things like boundaries, trails, sacred sites, gardens, hunting areas. And we'll acquire existing maps and GIS data where possible. I'll talk about field data in a minute. Few slides I just wanted to explain rather than read to you. So kind of a fun example of one of our Borneo sketch maps, produced by people that had no background in mapping at all, that intimately knew the land but had not ever created maps before. And you can see actually the names in both English and the local dialect. There's another example. You can see the rivers are an important element to the landscape. But of course, we're interested in the geospatial side of things, and so there have been, again, I thought I had hidden that slide. So there are grants that are available, and excuse me for 1 second, I had hidden the wrong slide. I wanted to show you a different version than the one that you're looking at. That's the slide I wanted to show you. This is the slide I didn't want to show you. Okay, so as I said, we're going to use existing data wherever possible. We're going to train trainers in the basics of GIS, features and attributes, geographic referencing, raster vector, some of the things you've learned in the last few weeks. We're going to conduct field data collection by GPS and other methods. And the goal is to develop skilled individuals that will work with the communities and to give a little bit of a buffer against this sort of technology shock. And create GIS map layers, generate maps that can be used for quality control and revisions among the community, passed around the community. And then finally, generate maps for local planning and interaction with outside entities such as the government. All right, so kind of a fun picture, makes me nostalgic to think of the days of getting out. And we initially were doing a lot of compass work, which is seen in the upper part of the screen, upper left, but we brought in GPS equipment found in the lower left-hand part of the screen. We actually had to push the antenna up on a pole in some places to get satellite reception for our GPS data collection. And doing so allowed us to plot data, create GIS